Look at this one, Preston Whitmore announced to the dining room, his voice carrying across the white tablecloths and crystal stemware with the practiced projection of a man who expected to be heard. He gestured toward the corner table where an elderly black man sat alone in clothes 2 sizes too large, a wool coat patched at the elbows and boots held together with electrical tape. This is exactly why we do this every year. These people need to see how the other half lives. Give them something to aspire to. Laughter rippled through the country club dining room, polite and measured, the kind of laughter that acknowledged a powerful man had made a joke without necessarily finding it funny. Preston Whitmore III stood at the center of his annual Thanksgiving charity spectacle, surrounded by fellow club members in cashmere sweaters and designer dresses, a photographer trailing behind him to capture every performative moment of generosity. The man in the corner did not react. His name was Clement Odia, though no one in this room had bothered to ask. He was 71 years old, with weathered hands that rested on the tablecloth with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, and eyes that tracked movement across the room with quiet precision. His posture, despite the oversized coat and the exhaustion carved into his features, kept straightening whenever someone addressed him directly, an unconscious habit he had never been able to break. On his lapel, nearly hidden beneath the frayed collar, sat a small American flag pin that had been polished until it gleamed. It was the only thing about him that shone. Preston approached the corner table with his photographer in tow, slowing his stride so the camera could capture his benevolent expression as he leaned down toward the elderly man. He spoke loudly, enunciating each word as though addressing someone who might not understand English, or perhaps someone he assumed to be mentally diminished. "So, my friend," he said, "what branch do you claim to have served in?" His tone made the question an accusation rather than an inquiry. Clement looked up. His voice came soft and measured, barely above a whisper. "Army, sir, and thank you for the meal." Preston's eyebrows rose theatrically. He turned to the nearby tables, ensuring his audience was watching. "You hear that, everyone? This one thinks he was Army." He made air quotes with his fingers, and more polite laughter followed. The dining room of the Whitmore Country Club had been decorated for the occasion with cornucopias and autumn leaves, a 12-foot banner reading Grateful Hearts, giving hands stretched across the back wall. 15 homeless individuals had been bussed in from the downtown shelter, seated at tables near the kitchen entrance, while club members occupied the prime real estate near the windows overlooking the golf course. The arrangement, Preston had explained to the local news crew he had invited, allowed the less fortunate to observe proper dining etiquette. Wherever you're watching this story unfold, whether from a city apartment or a rural farmhouse, from across the ocean or just down the street from a country club exactly like this one, take a moment to consider the quiet figures in your own community. The ones in worn coats and borrowed clothes. The ones who sit alone at corner tables while others decide what they deserve. Drop a comment telling us where you're joining from today, and if stories of hidden courage speak to you, consider subscribing to walk alongside us as we discover just how wrong first impressions can be. Because what Preston Whitmore did not know, what no one in that glittering dining room could possibly have suspected, was that in exactly 43 minutes he would learn that some debts cannot be paid with money. Some sacrifices cannot be measured in tax deductions. And some men cannot be judged by the clothes they wear or the tables they are assigned. At the corner table, Clement Odia took a small bite of turkey and closed his eyes for just a moment. The taste triggered something, a flash of memory he had spent 6 years trying to outrun. A kitchen filled with the smell of jollof rice and roasting bird. 2 children asking why Daddy had to leave again after Christmas. A woman's hand on his cheek, her voice promising that home would always be waiting. He opened his eyes, and the memory dissolved, leaving only the present. The white tablecloths, the curious stares, the man in the expensive sweater who had already decided exactly who Clement Odia was and what he deserved. Preston had moved on to another table, another homeless guest to perform his charity upon, but Clement could feel eyes still watching him. At a nearby table, an elderly Vietnam veteran named Terrence studied him with the particular attention of someone who recognized something familiar. Terrence had lost both legs to an IED in Iraq 20 years after his first war ended, and he had learned to read Men the Way Others Read books. Something about the way that one holds himself, Terrence murmured to no one in particular. Something about the stillness. Outside the windows, the November sun was beginning its descent toward the tree line, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. Inside, servers moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, their eyes carefully avoiding the corner where the homeless guests had been sequestered. None of them noticed the slight bulge in Clement's coat pocket where 2 sets of dog tags rested against his chest. None of them saw the edge of a tattoo peeking from beneath his sleeve when he reached for his water glass, numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone who had not earned the right to understand them. And none of them, not Preston Whitmore with his photographer and his pride, not the club members with their charitable pretensions, not even Terrence with his knowing eyes, could have predicted what those 43 minutes would bring. The clock on the wall showed 4:17 in the afternoon. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot, and a woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command stepped out into the fading light. She was not expected at this event. She had come for an entirely different reason. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Clement took another bite of turkey and waited for whatever came next. The way he had learned to wait through countless missions in countless countries, in places that did not exist on any official map. Patience was a skill that had kept him alive through decades of service. It would serve him now, in this strange battlefield of white tablecloths and whispered judgments. The clock ticked forward. 42 minutes remaining. The smell of roasting turkey had followed Clement through 6 years of exile, appearing without warning in soup kitchens and sheltered dining halls, on street corners where restaurants vented their exhaust into the cold air. Each time it found him, it dragged him backward through time to a place he could no longer bear to visit. That morning had begun the way all his mornings began, in the gray light beneath the Route 9 overpass where he had made his home for the past 3 years. The concrete pillar at his back provided cover from wind and sight lines in 3 directions, a position he had chosen with the unconscious tactical assessment that never turned off no matter how many years passed since his last mission. His sleeping bag, olive green and army surplus, had been folded with corners so precise they could have passed inspection at Fort Bragg. He had walked 4 miles to St. Michael's Church, where the outreach ministry served breakfast on Tuesdays and Thursdays and organized the annual Thanksgiving excursion to wherever would have them. This year, it was the Whitmore Country Club, a name that meant nothing to Clement, but drew murmurs of excitement from the other shelter residents who understood what such places represented. Sister Catherine had found him a coat from the donation bin, wool with a herringbone pattern that had once been expensive. It hung from his shoulders like a tent, but she had smiled and told him he looked distinguished. He had thanked her with the automatic courtesy that decades of military service had welded into his bones, and she had squeezed his hand with the particular gentleness reserved for those she suspected were carrying more than they showed. The bus ride had taken 40 minutes through suburbs that grew progressively more manicured, lawns expanding and houses retreating further from the road until they disappeared entirely behind walls and gates. Clement had watched through the window without seeing, his mind caught in the current that always pulled strongest on holidays. Thanksgiving 1987, his first as an American citizen, the ceremony completed just 3 weeks earlier in a federal courthouse in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Adora had insisted on cooking both traditions, the jollof rice of his Nigerian childhood alongside the turkey and stuffing of his adopted country. The kitchen had smelled of palm oil and sage, of 2 worlds blending into something new. The twins had been 6 years old, Marcus and Amara, too young to understand why their father kept leaving, but old enough to feel his absence like a missing tooth. They had asked him that Thanksgiving why he had to go again after Christmas, and he had knelt down to their level and promised that every time he left, he was making the world safer for them to grow up in. Adora had stood in the doorway watching, her arms crossed, her expression caught somewhere between pride and fear. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she had pressed her palm against his chest and told him that she understood why he served, that she had married a warrior and would not ask him to be anything else. But she had made him promise, made him swear on everything sacred, that he would always come home. He had kept that promise through Mogadishu and Bosnia, through Afghanistan and Iraq, through operations in countries whose names he could never speak aloud. He had kept it through wounds that should have killed him and losses that nearly did. For 31 years, he had kept that promise, walking back through the door of their home in Fayetteville every single time, until the day she broke hers. The cancer had come fast and without mercy, discovered in March and victorious by September. Clement had held her hand through every treatment, every surgery, every long night when the pain made her weep. He had called in every favor from every military hospital, had raged against doctors who could not give him a mission to complete, an enemy to defeat. But there was no enemy, only cells that had forgotten how to stop, and a body too tired to fight anymore. Her last words had been a command, delivered with the same quiet authority she had used to run their household through 3 decades of deployments. Stay with them, Clem. Do not disappear into yourself. Promise me. He had promised. He had held her hand and promised. And then she had closed her eyes, and the monitors had sung their terrible song, and something inside Clement O'Dea had shattered so completely that he could not find the pieces. The children had been grown by then, Marcus in his surgical residency in Philadelphia, Amara finishing her MBA at Georgetown. They had come home for the funeral, had stood beside him at the graveside, had tried to hold him together with their presence. But every time Clement looked at Marcus, he saw Adeora's smile. Every time he heard Amara laugh, he heard his wife's voice echoing beneath it. He had lasted 3 months. 3 months of wandering through the house they had built together, touching her things, sleeping on his side of the bed as though she might still return to hers. 3 months of his children calling with increasing concern in their voices, visiting on weekends with worried eyes. Then one morning he had woken before dawn, packed a single bag, and written a note that he left on the kitchen table. I love you both more than breath. I am sorry. I cannot be who you need me to be. Live your lives. Do not look for me. He had given the house to the children, signed over his accounts, and walked away from everything he had built. The VA had tried to find him, had sent letters to addresses he had already left. His children had hired private investigators, had posted flyers, had searched shelter from North Carolina to New York. But Clement O'Dea had spent 31 years learning how to disappear when necessary. He had evaded enemy patrols in terrain far more hostile than American cities. Finding a man who did not wish to be found, a man trained by the best special operations units in the world, was not a simple matter. 6 years. 6 Thanksgivings without the smell of jollof rice. 6 Christmases watching through windows as other families opened presents. He had tracked his children from a distance, had stood in the back of auditoriums at their achievements, had wept in parking lots after seeing them walk across stages to collect honors he could not share. Marcus had become a trauma surgeon, saving lives in the emergency room of a Philadelphia hospital. Amara had started a non-profit for veterans, had named it after Yosef Bekele, the name she had heard her father cry out in his nightmares throughout her childhood. They had built beautiful lives. They had honored their mother's memory. They had become everything Clement and Adeora had dreamed they might become. And he had watched it all from the shadows, convinced that his presence would only diminish what they had achieved, that the broken thing he had become would tarnish the family they deserved. The bus had stopped. The doors had opened, and Clement had stepped out into the parking lot of the Whitmore Country Club, adjusting his oversized coat and squaring his shoulders out of habit. Sister Catherine had asked him if he was ready for today. He had almost said no, almost turned around and walked back to the overpass where nothing could find him. But something had pulled him forward. Maybe it was the holiday. Maybe it was exhaustion from running. Or maybe, somewhere beneath 6 years of grief and guilt, a small flame of hope still flickered that he had not quite managed to extinguish. He had walked through those doors and taken his seat at the corner table. And when Preston Whitmore had approached with his cameras and his contempt, Clement had answered with the only truth that felt safe. Army, sir. And thank you for the meal. Now, sitting alone while the charity spectacle swirled around him, Clement reached into his coat pocket and touched the dog tags that rested there. His own, worn smooth by decades against his skin, and Yosef's, still carrying traces of blood in the stamped grooves that no amount of cleaning could remove. "Still here, brother," he whispered, so quietly that no one could hear. "Still trying." The clock on the wall showed 4:22. 38 minutes remained until everything changed. The bus had pulled into the country club parking lot at precisely 3:45 that afternoon, and Clement had assessed the grounds before his feet touched pavement. 3 exits visible from the main entrance, security cameras mounted at 15-meter intervals, a service road curving behind the building toward loading docks that would provide alternate egress if necessary. The evaluation happened without conscious thought, decades of training firing automatically like a reflex he could not suppress. The other shelter residents had hesitated at the grandeur of the entrance, a portico supported by white columns that framed double doors of polished mahogany. A woman named Delia, who had lost her apartment after her husband's medical bills consumed everything, had whispered that she felt like they were about to tour a museum. A young veteran named Joaquin, still fighting the demons of 2 deployments to Helmand Province, had shoved his hands into his pockets and stared at the ground. Clement had simply walked forward, his gait measured and unhurried, his eyes taking in everything while appearing to notice nothing. The skill had kept him alive in marketplaces rigged with explosives and villages where any doorway might hide an ambush. It served a different purpose now, helping him navigate a world that had become foreign in ways combat never had. Preston Whitmore had greeted them at the entrance with a photographer positioned to capture the moment from his most flattering angle. He had moved down the line, shaking hands with each guest, his smile fixed and practiced, his eyes sliding past faces without truly seeing them. When he reached Clement, he had paused. "That pin," Preston had said, gesturing toward the small American flag on Clement's lapel. "Where did you get it?" "It was my wife's," Clement had replied. "She pinned it on me the day I became citizen." Something had flickered across Preston's expression, a momentary crack in the performance that might have been genuine feeling. Then his features had reset to their default configuration of benevolent condescension, and he had moved on to the next guest without another word. Now, 30 minutes into the event, Clement sat at his assigned table near the kitchen service entrance. The position placed his back to a wall, sight lines to both the main dining room and the hallway leading to restrooms and emergency exits. He had not chosen the seat. It had been assigned by a hostess with a clipboard who had directed the sheltered guests to the tables furthest from windows. But he had accepted it without complaint, recognizing the tactical advantage, even as he understood the social slight it represented. The table seated 4. Beside him sat Terrence, the Vietnam veteran who had been studying him since they boarded the bus. Across from them sat Delia with her nervous hands and Joaquin with his 1,000-yard stare. None of them spoke much. They ate their turkey and stuffing with the careful attention of people who had learned not to take meals for granted. Terrence broke the silence first. His voice was low, meant only for Clement's ears. "What unit?" he asked. Clement glanced at him. "I'm sorry." Terrence's eyes, bright with intelligence beneath bushy gray eyebrows, held steady. "I was a door gunner with the 1st CAF. Did 2 tours in Vietnam, then went back as a contractor in 03. Lost my legs outside Fallujah." He paused. "I know how a combat soldier holds himself, and you hold yourself like someone who's seen more than most." Clement considered the question and the man asking it. The bond between veterans was something civilians rarely understood, a recognition that transcended branch and era and circumstance. It was the understanding that certain experiences marked a person permanently, left fingerprints on the soul that others who shared those experiences could read. "3rd Special Forces Group," Clement said quietly. "Long time ago." Terrence nodded slowly. "Green Beret." He let out a low whistle that drew a curious glance from Delia. "That explains a few things." "It does not explain anything," Clement replied. "It was just a job." But Terrence had seen his sleeve ride up when he reached for his water glass, had caught the edge of black ink disappearing beneath the fabric. He said nothing more, but his expression suggested that he understood the kind of job that left permanent marks on a man's skin. Across the dining room, Preston Whitmore was making his rounds with increasing theatrical flair. The news crew he had invited followed in his wake, camera lights illuminating his practiced gestures of charity. He paused at tables to pose for photographs with club members, occasionally directing the camera toward the shelter guests as though documenting exotic wildlife in their natural habitat. Clement watched without appearing to watch. He noted which club members seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the spectacle and which ones leaned into it with enthusiasm. He observed the servers moving between tables, their expressions carefully neutral, and wondered how many of them had served themselves. The military was full of people who ended up in service industry jobs, skills honed in combat, translated into the controlled chaos of restaurant work. One server in particular caught his attention. A young woman, perhaps 25, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and a small tattoo visible at her wrist when her sleeve shifted. She moved with efficiency and purpose, refilling glasses without being asked, clearing plates with minimal disruption. When she reached Clement's table, she paused for just a moment. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked. Her voice carried a note of genuine concern that distinguished it from the rote courtesy of her colleagues. "No, thank you," Clement replied. "The meal is excellent." She nodded, and as she turned away, he saw the full tattoo on her wrist. An eagle, globe, and anchor, the emblem of the United States Marine Corps. At the center of the dining room, Preston had begun working his way toward the corner tables with the news crew in tow. His voice carried above the ambient conversation as he explained to the camera how this annual event represented the club's commitment to community service. He spoke of gratitude and giving back, of showing those less fortunate that they were not forgotten. Clement felt Terrence tense beside him. The Vietnam veteran's hands had curled into fists beneath the table. "Easy," Clement murmured. "Not worth it." Terrence exhaled slowly. "I spent 18 months in a VA hospital after Fallujah. Met a lot of men like him. They want credit for caring without actually having to care." Clement had no response to that. He had spent 6 years avoiding exactly these situations, the places where his past might collide with his present in ways he could not control. But Sister Catherine had asked him to come, had said it might be good for him to be around people on a holiday, and he had been too tired to argue. Preston was 3 tables away now, his photographer repositioning for better angles. The news crew had their microphones extended, ready to capture whatever moments of inspiration the event might provide. Clement reached for his water glass, and his sleeve rode up again. The tattoo was more visible this time, black numbers against weathered brown skin. Coordinates, a date, initials that belonged to a dead man. Terrence saw it. His intake of breath was sharp enough to make Delia look up from her plate. At the entrance to the dining room, a woman with silver hair and commanding posture had appeared. She spoke briefly with the hostess, her eyes scanning the room with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. Her gaze moved from table to table, pausing on faces, searching for something or someone specific. Clement did not notice her. His attention was fixed on Preston Whitmore, who had reached the adjacent table and was loudly explaining to the camera that these events helped the less fortunate see how proper society functioned. The clock on the wall showed 4:29. 31 minutes remained, and the woman at the entrance had stopped scanning the room. Her eyes had found the corner table, had fixed on the elderly man in the oversized coat, and her face had gone pale with recognition. Preston Whitmore had perfected the art of working a room over 2 decades of networking events and charity galas. He understood that philanthropy was as much about perception as impact, that the photograph of generosity often mattered more than the generosity itself. His annual Thanksgiving dinner for the homeless had become a cornerstone of his public image, generating social media content that his publicists deployed strategically throughout the following year. The news crew from Channel 7 followed him like ducklings as he approached the corner tables where the shelter guests had been seated. Their camera lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of people who had not asked to be illuminated, who had come for a hot meal and found themselves conscripted into someone else's narrative. Preston stopped at the table adjacent to Clement's, where a young mother named Rosa sat with her 2 children. She had lost her job when the factory closed, had lost her apartment 3 months later, had been sleeping in her car until the shelter found room. Her children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, wore clothes that were clean but obviously secondhand, their faces betraying the particular anxiety of children who have learned that stability is not guaranteed. Now this, Preston announced to the camera, is exactly why we do this. He gestured toward Rosa and her children with the flourish of a game show host revealing a prize. A family in need, given the chance to share a real Thanksgiving dinner. He leaned down toward the children, his smile widening. "Are you enjoying yourselves, kids?" The boy nodded without speaking. The girl pressed closer to her mother. Preston straightened and addressed the camera directly. "This is what the Whitmore Country Club is all about. Opening our doors to those less fortunate. Showing them that community means something." Rosa's expression remained carefully neutral, but Clement could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands grip her napkin beneath the table. She had not come here to be a prop in someone's performance. None of them had. The news crew pivoted toward Clement's table. Preston followed, his eyes landing on the elderly man in the oversized coat with the American flag pin that seemed almost defiant against the worn fabric. "And here we have another guest," Preston said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like curiosity but carried an edge of something else. "Earlier you mentioned you were Army." His inflection made the word a question rather than an acknowledgement. Clement met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir." Preston glanced at the camera to ensure it was capturing the exchange. A lot of people claim military service these days. It's become quite fashionable among the... He paused, searching for the appropriate euphemism, transient community. Terrence's hands tightened into fists again. Joaquin, who had been staring at his plate throughout the meal, looked up with sudden sharp attention. "I do not claim anything," Clement replied. His voice remained soft, steady, without defensiveness. "I served. That is all." Preston's smile flickered but held. He sensed an opportunity, a moment that might play well on the evening news. The generous host gently challenging a dubious claim, protecting the honor of real veterans from those who would steal it. "You know," he said, turning slightly so his profile faced the camera, "we have a lot of actual veterans in this club. Men and women who serve with distinction. They find it," he paused again, searching for the word, troubling when people appropriate military identity for sympathy. The dining room had grown quieter. Conversations at nearby tables had stalled as members turned to watch the exchange. Even the servers had slowed their movements, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Clement said nothing. He had learned decades ago that silence was often the most powerful response to provocation, that men who sought reactions became uncertain when none were offered. Preston pressed forward, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "That pin on your coat, that flag pin, do you think wearing that makes you patriotic? Do you think putting on symbols of service substitutes for actual sacrifice?" At the entrance of the dining room, the silver-haired woman had begun moving toward the corner tables. Her path was deliberate but unhurried, her eyes never leaving the elderly man in the oversized coat. A club member tried to intercept her with a greeting, but she sidestepped with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to navigating obstacles. "The pin was my wife's," Clement said. The words came out quieter than before, weighted with something Preston could not identify. "She gave it to me 37 years ago. I have worn it every day since she died." Preston hesitated. The response had not fit the script he had been writing in his head, the narrative of a fraud exposed by righteous questioning. But he had committed to a direction, and the camera was rolling, and Preston Whitmore III had never been good at admitting miscalculation. He reached toward Clement's lapel, fingers extended as if to examine the pin more closely. "That's a touching story," he said. "But stories are easy. Anyone can tell a story." His hand made contact with the coat's fabric, tugging slightly to get a better look at the pin. The movement pulled the oversized garment askew, and Clement's left sleeve rode up past his wrist, past the heel of his hand, exposing the forearm beneath. The tattoo was impossible to miss. black ink against weathered brown skin, the lines slightly faded by time, but still perfectly legible. Numbers arranged in a specific pattern that anyone with military knowledge would recognize as coordinates. Below them, a date. October 3rd, 1993. And beneath that, two sets of initials intertwined with an emblem that made Preston's photographer lower his camera in confusion. Terrence saw it clearly. His face went slack with recognition. He had seen that emblem before, had heard stories about what those particular coordinates meant, had watched documentaries about the event of that specific date. The silver-haired woman was close now, close enough to see what the movement had revealed. She stopped 3 feet from the table, her hand rising involuntarily to press against her chest. Preston noticed none of this. His attention had fixed on the tattoo, on the numbers he did not understand, on the emblem that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something to others. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the silent dining room. Some kind of prison identification. Gongmorking. Clement slowly, deliberately lowered his sleeve. His expression had not changed, but something in his posture had shifted, a straightening of the spine that added inches to his apparent height, despite his seated position. "No, sir," he said. His voice remained soft, but it carried now, reaching corners of the room that his earlier whispers had not touched. "Those are coordinates. For a place I cannot forget, no matter how much I might wish to." The clock on the wall showed 4:37. 23 minutes remained. And Ruth Castellano, Brigadier General retired, former commander of the Joint Special Operations Support Element, finally found her voice. "Sentinel," she whispered. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "Oh, dear God." "Clement." The name hung in the air like smoke from a distant explosion. "Sentinel." A single word spoken by a woman who should not have been there, recognized by a man who had spent 6 years trying to forget who he had once been. Clement turned slowly toward the voice. His eyes found Ruth Castellano standing 3 feet away, her silver hair immaculate, her posture as rigid as the day she had pinned his first commendation to his chest nearly 4 decades ago. She had aged, as they all had, but her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had made her one of the most respected commanders in Special Operations history. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that could bridge the distance between the man he had been and the man he had become. Preston Whitmore watched the exchange with growing confusion. The homeless man and the distinguished-looking woman clearly knew each other, but the nature of their connection eluded him. He glanced at his photographer, who had lowered his camera entirely and was staring at the scene with undisguised curiosity. "Excuse me," Preston interjected, reasserting himself into a conversation he did not understand. "Do you know this man?" Ruth did not look at him. Her attention remained fixed on Clement with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms far more important than this one. "Know him," she repeated. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another context. "I spent 3 years of my career trying to keep him alive, and another 6 wondering what happened to him after he disappeared." Preston's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. He sensed that the narrative had slipped beyond his control, that forces were at work in this room that his wealth and social position could not influence. The feeling was unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. The news crew had repositioned themselves, sensing that whatever was unfolding might be more compelling than the staged charity footage they had been capturing. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chun, who had covered human interest stories for 7 years, watched with the particular attention of someone recognizing a story that might actually matter. Clement finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for Ruth, but the silence in the dining room carried it further than he intended. "You should not be here, General." Ruth's composure cracked slightly at the title. She shook her head, a small gesture that contained multitudes of emotion. "I retired 8 years ago, Clement, and I've been looking for you almost as long." Around them, the country club members had abandoned all pretense of their own conversations. They watched the exchange with the rapt attention of theater audiences, sensing that they were witnessing something significant without understanding what it meant. Terrence understood. The Vietnam veteran had pushed back from the table, his wheelchair creaking softly as he repositioned himself for a better view. His eyes moved between Clement and Ruth, calculating, connecting dots that others in the room could not see. Preston attempted once more to regain control of the situation. "Now wait just a moment," he said, stepping forward with his chest puffed slightly. "This is my event, my club. If there's some kind of reunion happening here, I think we deserve to know who exactly we've invited into our establishment." The word landed like a slap. Invited. As though Clement and the other shelter residents had been granted a privilege rather than offered charity. As though their presence was a gift that could be revoked at the whim of their benefactors. Ruth turned to face Preston for the first time. Her gaze moved across him slowly, assessing, categorizing, dismissing. It was the look she had once used on junior officers who had overstepped their authority, and it had lost none of its power in the years since her retirement. "You want to know who you invited?" she said. Her voice had dropped into a register that made Preston take an involuntary step backward. "You want to understand who is sitting at your table, eating your turkey, wearing clothes from your donation bin?" Preston nodded, though the gesture seemed less certain than he intended. Ruth turned back to Clement. Her expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "May I?" she asked him. It was not really a question. It was a request for permission to speak truths that Clement had spent 6 years burying. The silence stretched between them. Clement looked down at his hands, at the weathered skin and the scars that mapped decades of service across his knuckles. He thought of Adora, of the promise he had broken by leaving, of the children he had abandoned to their grief because he could not carry his own. He thought of Yosef, bleeding out in that Mogadishu street, whispering his final order with lungs that were already filling with blood. "Get them home, Clem. That's the mission." He had completed that mission. He had carried wounded men through streets that ran red, had held the line while helicopters extracted the survivors, had done everything asked of him and more. But he had never been able to complete the mission Adora had given him. Stay with them. Do not disappear. Ruth was still waiting. The room was still watching. Preston was still standing there with his confusion and his cameras and his desperate need to understand a situation that had spiraled beyond his comprehension. Clement raised his head. His eyes met Ruth's, and something passed between them that only those who have shared impossible circumstances could understand. A recognition of duty, an acknowledgement of cost, a silent agreement that some truths, once spoken, could never be unspoken. He nodded once. A small gesture. Permission granted. Ruth Castellano squared her shoulders. She turned to face the room, to face Preston and his cameras and his assembled guests and his carefully constructed theater of charitable performance. The clock on the wall showed 4:41. 19 minutes remained, and Ruth began to speak. "This man," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room, served his country for 31 years in the United States Army Special Forces. He completed over 200 missions in theaters of operation spanning 4 continents. He holds a Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor Device, 2 Purple Hearts, and commendations from 3 different presidential administrations. She paused, letting the words settle into the shocked silence. "But that is not why you should know his name." Ruth Castellano had delivered briefings to Joint Chiefs of Staff, had stood in the Situation Room while presidents weighed decisions that would shape the course of nations. She had learned that the most powerful truths required no embellishment, that facts delivered with precision cut deeper than any rhetorical flourish. She drew a breath and continued. October 3rd, 1993. Mogadishu, Somalia. Most of you know this date from the book or the movie. Black Hawk Down. What you do not know, what remained classified for over a decade, was that there were additional special operations elements on the ground that day. Elements whose missions have never been fully acknowledged. The dining room had become a vacuum, all ambient sounds seemingly absorbed by the weight of her words. Even the servers had stopped moving, trays balanced forgotten on their palms. Master Sergeant Clement Odia, call sign Sentinel, was the senior operator of a Foreman Special Forces advisory team attached to Task Force Ranger. When the helicopters went down and American soldiers became trapped in hostile territory, his team was supposed to hold position and maintain their advisory role. She glanced at Clement, whose eyes had drifted to some middle distance that only he could see. The memories were pulling him backward, she knew. Back to streets that ran with blood and buildings that collapsed under rocket fire and the endless percussive rhythm of gunfire that had lasted 18 hours. Instead, Ruth continued. Master Sergeant Oduya made a decision. Against orders, against protocol, against every calculation of acceptable risk. He and his spotter, Sergeant First Class Joseph Bekele, left their position and entered the city. Preston Whitmore had gone very still. The smug certainty had drained from his features, replaced by something that might have been the first genuine emotion he had displayed all afternoon. Over the next 18 hours, Ruth said, those two men made 11 separate insertions into hostile territory. They extracted 7 wounded Rangers for Delta operators and 2 helicopter pilots. They carried men who could not walk. They provided covering fire for evacuation routes that had been deemed impassable. They did this while under continuous enemy contact, while wounded themselves, while watching friends die around them. The young server with the Marine Corps tattoo had pressed her hand against her mouth. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound. On their 12th insertion, Ruth continued, her voice dropping slightly. Sergeant First Class Bekele was hit. 3 rounds to the back while providing cover fire for their extraction. He died in Master Sergeant Oduya's arms 90 seconds later. The coordinates on his arm, Terrence said suddenly, his voice rough with understanding. Those are the coordinates where his partner died. Ruth nodded. The location is precise to within 3 meters. Clement has carried that place with him for 31 years. It is tattooed on his skin because it is already tattooed on his soul. Clement had not moved throughout the recitation. His hands remained flat on the white tablecloth, his breathing steady and controlled, but those who looked closely could see the tremor that ran through his shoulders. The weight of hearing his own history spoken aloud by someone else, of having the carefully constructed walls of his anonymity dismantled brick by brick, was almost more than he could bear. Preston found his voice, though it emerged weaker than before. That's a remarkable story, he said, but stories can be fabricated. How do we know any of this is true? Ruth turned to face him with an expression that made him take another step backward. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a worn leather folder that she had carried with her for 6 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Because I wrote the recommendation, she said. I testified before the review board. I stood in the White House Rose Garden while the president placed the medal around his neck. She opened the folder and removed a photograph, yellowed with age but still perfectly clear. It showed a younger Clement Oduya in dress uniform, standing beside a president whose face was recognizable to everyone in the room. Around Clement's neck hung a pale blue ribbon supporting a 5-point golden star. The Medal of Honor, Ruth said. The highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Given for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The photograph passed from hand to hand through the silent dining room. Club members who had spent the afternoon performing charity for people they considered beneath them now stared at evidence that one of those people had achieved something none of them could ever claim. Preston's face had gone the color of old paper. His photographer had finally raised his camera again, capturing not the staged moments of philanthropy, but the genuine human drama unfolding before them. The news crew was recording everything. Jessica Chun, the reporter, had tears in her eyes, but kept her microphone steady, understanding that she was witnessing something that transcended the human interest story she had been assigned to cover. Ruth returned her attention to Clement. She crossed the remaining distance between them and lowered herself to one knee beside his chair, a gesture of respect that carried profound meaning from a general to a sergeant. "We look for you," she said softly. "After 8 hours passed, your children hired investigators. The VA sent caseworkers to every shelter on the eastern seaboard. We never stopped looking. Clement's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek, disappearing into the gray stubble of his jaw. "I cannot stay," he whispered. "I could not look at them without seeing her. I thought I was protecting them by leaving." Ruth reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm and warm, the touch of someone who had led soldiers through darkness and understood the particular weight of survival. "They never stopped loving you," she said, "and they never stopped searching." The clock on the wall showed 4:47. 13 minutes remained, but the countdown no longer mattered. Something far more significant had already begun. The photograph completed its circuit through the dining room and returned to Ruth's hands. She tucked it carefully back into the leather folder, handling it with the reverence accorded to sacred objects. Around her, the country club members sat in stunned silence, their half-eaten Thanksgiving dinners growing cold on plates that suddenly seemed obscenely extravagant. Clement remained motionless in his chair. The tear had dried on his cheek, but the tremor in his shoulders had not subsided. 6 years of carefully constructed isolation were crumbling around him, and he did not know whether to feel liberated or terrified. Preston Whitmore stood apart from the gathering, his photographer forgotten at his side. The performance of philanthropy he had orchestrated with such precision had collapsed into something raw and real, something his wealth and social position could neither control nor comprehend. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, then finally managed a single word. "Why?" Ruth turned to face him. "Why what, Mr. Whitmore?" Preston gestured vaguely toward Clement, toward the corner table, toward the entire arrangement he had designed to showcase his generosity. "Why is he here? Why is a Medal of Honor recipient living on the streets? Why did no one know?" The questions carried genuine bewilderment rather than accusation. For perhaps the first time in the afternoon, Preston Whitmore was asking something because he truly wanted to understand the answer. Ruth considered the question. She had asked herself the same thing countless times over the past 6 years, had lain awake at night, wondering how a man she had watched receive a nation's highest honor had vanished so completely into the margins of society. "Because he chose to disappear," she said finally, "and because he was trained by the best special operations units in the world to do exactly that when necessary. Finding someone who does not wish to be found, someone with his skills and experience, is nearly impossible." But why would he choose that? Preston pressed. He had family. He had recognition. He had everything. Clement's voice cut through the exchange, soft but clear. "I had everything. And then I lost the only thing that mattered." The dining room fell silent again. Even the ambient sounds of the kitchen had ceased, the staff drawn to doorways and service windows by the drama unfolding in the main hall. Clement raised his head and met Preston's eyes directly. "My wife was my anchor," he said. "For 31 years, she was the reason I came home. Every mission, every deployment, every moment when death seemed certain, I survived because I knew she was waiting. When she died, I lost the ability to navigate without her." His gaze shifted to Ruth. "I thought leaving would protect my children from watching me fall apart. I thought my absence would hurt them less than my presence. I was wrong, but by the time I understood that, I had been gone so long that returning seemed impossible." Ruth squeezed his hand. "It was never impossible, Clement. It was only ever hard." At the nearby tables, the other shelter residents watched with expressions ranging from shock to recognition. Delia had her arms wrapped around her children, holding them close as tears streamed down her face. Joaquin, the young veteran with the 1,000-yard stare, had straightened in his chair, something shifting behind his eyes as he listened to a story that echoed his own struggles. Terrence wheeled himself closer to the table. His voice was gruff when he spoke. 6 years on the streets. How did you survive?" Clement looked at the Vietnam veteran, at the empty trouser legs pinned neatly beneath his wheelchair, at the eyes that held decades of their own impossible memories. "Day labor," he said. "Docks, warehouses, anywhere that needed strong backs, and asked no questions. Shelter meals when I could not find work. The overpass when everywhere else was full." Terrence nodded slowly. The brotherhood of those who had served and struggled needed no further explanation. They understood each other in ways that civilians never could. The young server with the Marine Corps tattoo approached the table. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Sir," she said, addressing Clement directly, "I did 2 tours in Helmand. Lost 3 friends to IEDs. When I got back, I couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't function." She paused, swallowing hard. "This job, this place, it's me trying to rebuild. But some days I wonder if there's any point." Clement studied her face, seeing the familiar shadows of combat behind her eyes. "What is your name?" he asked. "Corporal Maria Reyes," she replied. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Clement nodded. "Corporal Reyes," he said, "the point is that you are still trying. That is all any of us can do. Keep trying. Keep breathing. Keep finding reasons to see the next sunrise." Maria's composure cracked, and she pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sob. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, sir." The exchange rippled outward through the room. Club members who had spent the afternoon treating the shelter guests as objects of charity now saw them differently. The homeless were no longer abstract recipients of seasonal goodwill. They were people with histories and hopes and wounds that did not show on the surface. Preston Whitmore watched all of this with an expression that seemed to be undergoing a profound transformation. The certainty that had defined his approach to the afternoon had evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Ruth released Clement's hand and stood. She turned to address the room, her voice carrying the authority of a lifetime of command. "What you are witnessing," she said, "is not an anomaly. Veterans across this country are struggling. They are living in shelters, under bridges, in cars. They are battling demons that civilians cannot imagine, carrying wounds that do not appear on any medical chart. And most of them suffer in silence because they have been trained to endure without complaint." She let the words settle before continuing. "But they should not have to suffer alone, and they should not have to wait for chance encounters in country club dining rooms to be seen for who they really are." The clock on the wall showed 4:53. 7 minutes remained, but time had lost its meaning. What mattered now was what would happen next. Ruth Castellano reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a mobile phone. The device seemed almost incongruous in her weathered hands, a bridge between the analog world of her military career and the digital present that had continued without her. She looked at Clement with an expression that balanced hope against the possibility of rejection. "Your children are in Philadelphia," she said. "Mark has finished his surgical residency 4 years ago. He runs the trauma unit at Jefferson Hospital now. Amara's nonprofit has grown to serve over 2,000 veterans annually." She named it the Bekele Foundation. Clement's breath caught at the name. Yosef's name, carried forward by the daughter who had heard it whispered in her father's nightmares throughout her childhood. The weight of that tribute pressed against his chest like a physical force. "They never stopped looking," Ruth continued. "Every month, Amara sends updated photographs and contact information to every VA facility, every homeless outreach program, every veterans organization in the country. She maintains a website with your photograph and service record. She has spoken at conferences about missing veterans, about families searching for fathers and mothers and children who disappeared into their own pain." Clement closed his eyes. The image of his daughter standing before crowds, holding up his photograph, begging strangers for information about her lost father, was almost more than he could bear. "I have their numbers," Ruth said softly. "I have had them for 6 years, waiting for this moment. I can call them right now. They could be here in less than 3 hours." The dining room held its collective breath. The news camera continued recording, capturing the moment when a Medal of Honor recipient confronted the possibility of reunion with the family he had abandoned. Clement's hands trembled on the white tablecloth. He had imagined this moment countless times during his years on the streets. He had rehearsed the words he might say, the apologies he might offer, the explanations that could never truly explain. But imagination had not prepared him for the reality of the choice now before him. "What if they hate me?" he whispered. The words emerged broken, stripped of the composure he had maintained throughout the afternoon's confrontation. "What if they have healed without me? What if my return only tears open wounds that have finally begun to close? Ruth knelt beside him again, her knees protesting the hard floor, but her determination overriding physical discomfort. "Clement," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "I have spoken with your children. I have watched them search. I have seen the hope that refuses to die in their eyes every time a new lead emerges. They have not healed. They have survived. There is a profound difference." Terrence wheeled closer, his gruff voice cutting through the emotional tension. "Brother," he said, "I spent 20 years running from my own family after I lost my legs. Thought I was protecting them from the burden of caring for a broken man. Know what happened when I finally let them back in?" Clement looked at him, waiting. "They told me the burden was never the wheelchair," Terrence said. "The burden was not knowing if I was alive or dead. The burden was loving someone who had vanished." His voice cracked slightly. "Your kids are carrying that weight right now. You can put it down for them with a single phone call." Maria Reyes had moved closer as well, her server's apron twisted between anxious hands. "Sir," she said, "I lost my father when I was 12. Not to death. To his own demons. He walked out and never came back." She paused, steadying herself. "I would give anything to have him call. Even after all these years. Even if I was angry. The anger would mean he was alive. The anger would mean there was something to rebuild." Around the room, others were nodding. Club members who had entered the afternoon expecting to perform charity were instead receiving something far more valuable. A window into the complexity of human pain and the fierce persistence of love. Preston Whitmore stood apart from a gathering, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The man he had mocked, had dismissed, had treated as a prop for his own self-aggrandizement, was being offered a chance at redemption that Preston himself had never considered needing. But watching Clement struggle with the decision, watching the war between fear and hope play out across those weathered features, Preston felt something shift in his understanding of the world. He had spent his entire adult life measuring worth in dollars and social standing. He had never considered that the truest measure of a person might be their capacity to face their own failures and choose differently. Clement opened his eyes. He looked at Ruth, at the phone in her hand, at the bridge it represented between his past and his possible future. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. "I do not know their numbers anymore. I threw away my phone years ago, so I would not be tempted to call." Ruth's expression softened. "I know," she said. "That is why I have kept them. For exactly this moment." She began to dial. The electronic tones seemed unnaturally loud in the silent room, each beep a step closer to a conversation that would change everything. Clement watched her fingers move across the screen. His heart hammered against his ribs with an intensity he had not felt since combat. The same flood of adrenaline that preceded moments when life and death hung in balance. The phone began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Ruth extended the device toward Clement. Her eyes held steady on his, willing him to take this final step across the threshold he had been circling for 6 years. His hand shook as he reached for the phone. The weight of it seemed impossible, as though it contained not just circuits and glass, but the accumulated mass of every missed birthday, every unattended graduation, every whispered goodnight that had never reached its intended ears. A voice answered on the 4th ring. Female. Professional but warm. Bekele Foundation. This is Amara Odia. How can I help you? Clement pressed the phone against his ear. His daughter's voice, heard for the first time in 6 years, flooded through him like electricity. The clock on the wall showed 4:57. 3 minutes remained. But the countdown had become irrelevant. The only moment that mattered was this one. Amara, he said, his voice cracking on the syllables of her name. It is Dad. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4, 5. Clement could hear his daughter breathing, could almost feel her processing the impossible information that had just traveled through the cellular network into her ear. Then a sound emerged from the phone that made everyone in the dining room freeze. It was not a word. It was something more primal, a cry that contained 6 years of searching and hoping and refusing to give up compressed into a single exhalation of disbelief. "Daddy!" The word shattered something in Clement that he had not known was still intact. His composure, maintained through decades of combat and years of homelessness and an afternoon of public humiliation, finally collapsed entirely. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he gripped the phone like a lifeline. "I am here," he managed. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry, baby girl." Through the phone, audible to those standing closest, came the sound of Amara Oduyo weeping. "Where are you?" she demanded, her voice breaking between words. "Where are you right now? Tell me exactly where you are." Clement looked around the dining room as though seeing it for the first time. His eyes found Ruth, who nodded encouragingly. "The Whitmore Country Club," he said. "In Westchester. There is a Thanksgiving dinner, and I am here, and Ruth found me. General Castellano. She found me." The sound of rapid movement came through the phone. Keys jangling. A door opening. "Stay there," Amara commanded, her voice shifting from grief to fierce determination. "Do not move. Do not go anywhere. I am calling Marcus. We will be there in 2 hours. Maybe less. Do you understand me? Do not disappear again." "I will not," Clement whispered. "I promise. I will be here." "Swear it," Amara demanded. "Swear, on Mom's memory." The invocation hit Clement like a physical blow. He closed his eyes and saw Adaora's face, saw her smile on the day they married, saw her holding their newborn twins, saw her in that hospital bed with monitors singing their terrible song. "I swear on your mother's memory," he said. "I will be here when you arrive." A shuddering breath came through the phone. Then, softer now, almost childlike, "I never stopped looking, Daddy. Not for one day. I knew you were alive somewhere. I knew you would come back to us." Clement could not speak. The words lodged in his throat, blocked by 6 years of accumulated grief and guilt and desperate love that had never diminished no matter how far he ran. Ruth gently took the phone from his trembling hand. "Amara," she said, "this is General Castellano. Your father is safe. He is surrounded by people who will make sure he stays exactly where he is until you arrive. Drive carefully. He will be waiting." She ended the call and placed the phone on the table. Then she did something that made the watching crowd draw a collective breath. She came to attention, her posture snapping to military precision despite her civilian clothes, and rendered a salute to the weeping man in the oversized coat. "Welcome back, Master Sergeant," she said. "It has been an honor to serve with you." The gesture broke something loose in the room. Terrence, unable to stand, straightened in his wheelchair and raised his hand to his brow. Maria Reyes, tears still streaming, followed suit. Around the dining room, other veterans who had remained anonymous throughout the afternoon rose to their feet and saluted. A cook emerged from the kitchen, his white uniform bearing the telltale signs of military bearing beneath the civilian role, and added his tribute to the growing display. Clement looked at them through blurred vision. These strangers, these fellow warriors, offering him the respect he had spent 6 years believing he no longer deserved. The weight of their recognition pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Preston Whitmore watched the spontaneous ceremony with an expression of profound dislocation. Everything he had believed about this afternoon, about these people, about his own place in the hierarchy of human worth, had been dismantled piece by piece. He stood at the margins of something sacred, an outsider to a brotherhood he could never join but was only now beginning to understand. The news camera captured it all. Jessica Chun had stopped trying to control her tears, letting them fall freely as she ensured every moment was documented. This was no longer a human interest story about holiday charity. This was something else entirely, a testament to sacrifice and survival and the unbreakable bonds between those who had served. The photograph would appear on the front page of newspapers across the country by morning. The video would accumulate millions of views within days. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the man in the corner of the Whitmore Country Club dining room, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to his resurrection. Ruth lowered her salute and placed a gentle hand on Clement's shoulder. 2 hours, she said. Your children will be here in 2 hours. Can you hold on that long? Clement wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The gesture was almost childlike, incongruous with everything the room now knew about his history. He looked at Ruth with an expression that held equal parts terror and hope. "I have been holding on for 6 years," he said. "2 more hours will not break me." But even as he spoke the words, he was not entirely certain they were true. The prospect of seeing his children, of looking into faces that carried Adeora's features, of confronting the magnitude of what his absence had cost them, loomed before him like a final mission from which there could be no extraction. The clock on the wall showed 5 o'clock exactly. Outside the windows, the November sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside, Clement O'Dea sat in his donated coat and his taped-together boots, waiting for his family to find him at last. The 2 hours that followed were unlike anything the Whitmore Country Club had ever witnessed. The carefully orchestrated charity event had transformed into something organic and unscripted, a vigil that grew in size and intensity as word spread through the building and beyond. Ruth stationed herself beside Clement like a sentinel, her presence a bulwark against the waves of attention that threatened to overwhelm him. She fielded questions from club members who approached with hesitant curiosity, deflecting those that seemed intrusive while allowing through the ones that carried genuine compassion. The kitchen staff, led by the cook who had revealed his own military service with that salute, began preparing fresh food. Not the carefully portioned charity plates that had been designed to photograph well, but substantial meals meant to nourish. They brought coffee and water, and eventually a blanket that someone had retrieved from the manager's office when they noticed Clement shivering despite the room's warmth. Terrence wheeled himself to a position beside the table and refused to move. The Vietnam veteran had appointed himself an informal guard, his weathered eyes tracking anyone who approached with an intensity that discouraged casual intrusion. He and Clement did not speak much. They did not need to. The silence between them was the comfortable quiet of men who understood each other's wounds without requiring explanation. Maria Reyes had been relieved of her serving duties by a manager who, for once, seemed to grasp that something more important than table service was occurring. She sat at the edge of the gathering, close enough to feel included, but far enough to maintain the respectful distance that seemed appropriate. Every few minutes she glanced at Clement, as though confirming that he was still there, that this was actually happening. Preston Whitmore had retreated to a corner of the room where he stood in uncharacteristic silence. His photographer had long since stopped capturing images, recognizing that the story unfolding was beyond the scope of their assignment. The publicist who usually shaped Preston's charitable activities had not been summoned. This was not an event that could be managed or spun. At 5:45, Preston approached the table. Ruth stiffened, prepared to intercept, but something in his demeanor gave her pause. The arrogance had drained from his posture. He moved like a man approaching a memorial rather than a photo opportunity. "Master Sergeant O'Dea," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the projection that had characterized his earlier performance. "I owe you an apology." Clement looked up at him. The tears had dried on his face, leaving tracks through the dust that had accumulated during his years on the streets. He said nothing, waiting. Preston swallowed visibly. "I have spent my entire life measuring people by their net worth, by their social standing, by the clothes they wear and the addresses where they live." He paused, struggling with words that did not come naturally. "I looked at you and saw exactly what I expected to see. A charity case. Someone to be pitted and photographed and forgotten by tomorrow." The dining room had grown quiet again, attention drawn to this unexpected confession. "My father," Preston continued, "bought his way out of Vietnam, paid for a medical deferment that everyone knew was fraudulent. He built his fortune while men like you were bleeding in jungles and deserts halfway around the world. I grew up knowing that, carrying that knowledge like a stone in my chest." He shook his head slowly. "I think I convinced myself that writing checks to veterans organizations balanced the scales somehow. That hosting dinners like this one made up for what my family failed to contribute. But watching you today, hearing what you sacrificed, what you lost, I understand that I have been performing charity to make myself feel better about inherited shame. Clement studied the younger man's face, searching for the performance that had defined every earlier interaction. He found none. Whatever was happening inside Preston Whitmore appeared to be genuine. Apology accepted, Clement said finally. His voice was soft but clear. Shame is a heavy burden, Mr. Whitmore. I have carried my own for many years. It does not get lighter by pretending it is not there. Preston nodded, his eyes glistening with moisture he was clearly fighting to control. What can I do, he asked. Not for cameras. Not for credit. What can I actually do to help? Ruth answered before Clement could respond. You can start by listening, she said. Veterans who end up on the streets do not need pity. They need jobs, housing, mental health support, and most of all, they need to be seen as human beings rather than symbols of either tragedy or triumph. She gestured toward the other shelter residents scattered throughout the dining room, many of whom had been drawn into conversations with club members that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Every person in this room has a story, she continued. Most of them are not as dramatic as Clement's. That does not make them less worthy of attention. Preston absorbed her words with the focused intensity of someone taking notes for an exam he desperately wanted to pass. He nodded slowly, then excused himself and moved toward the table where Rosa sat with her 2 children. He lowered himself into an empty chair and, for the first time all afternoon, began to listen rather than speak. Clement watched the transformation with something approaching wonder. 6 years of living among the discarded and dismissed had taught him to expect nothing from people like Preston Whitmore. The capacity for change that he was witnessing challenged assumptions he had not known he carried. At 6:15, Ruth's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and then at Clement. They are 20 minutes away, she said. Marcus is driving. Amara says they have not stopped crying since they got in the car. Clement's hands began to tremble again. The 2 hours of waiting had allowed him to construct fragile walls of composure, but the imminent arrival of his children threatened to demolish them entirely. Ruth took his hand. You survived Mogadishu, she said quietly. You survived 31 years of combat operations. You survived 6 years on streets. You can survive this. Clement shook his head. Those things were easy, he whispered. I knew who the enemy was. I knew what victory looked like. This is different. This is harder. Ruth squeezed his fingers. The hardest things always are, she replied. But you do not have to face them alone anymore. Outside, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car turned in from the main road, moving faster than caution would advise. The car had barely stopped moving when both doors flew open. Marcus emerged from the driver's side, his surgical scrubs still visible beneath a hastily thrown jacket, his face bearing the same strong jaw and broad shoulders that Clement saw in the mirror every morning. Amara came from the passenger's side, her professional attire rumpled from the frantic drive, her braided hair escaping its careful arrangement. They did not walk toward the entrance. They ran. Inside the dining room, Clement had risen from his chair at the sound of tires on gravel. His legs felt uncertain beneath him, weakened by the weight of the moment pressing down from above. Ruth stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his elbow, ready to steady him if necessary. The doors burst open. For one terrible, beautiful moment, no one moved. Marcus and Amara stood at the threshold, their eyes scanning the room until they found the figure in the oversized coat standing near the corner table. 6 years of photographs and memories and desperate searching collapsed into a single frozen instant of recognition. Then Amara made a sound that was not quite a word, something between his name and a sob, and she was moving again. Her heels clattered against the polished floor as she crossed the distance that had separated them for 2,190 days. She hit him like a wave breaking against the shore. Her arms wrapped around him with a ferocity that drove the breath from his lungs, her face pressing into his chest, her entire body shaking with sobs as she no longer tried to control. "Daddy," she wept. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Clement's arms came up slowly, as though moving through water. His hands touched her back, felt the reality of her presence, and something inside him that had been clenched for 6 years finally released. He pulled her close and buried his face in her hair and wept with an abandon he had not permitted himself since the day Adora died. Marcus reached him a moment later. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his long arms around both of them, creating a shelter of flesh and bone that enclosed the 3 surviving members of the Odia family for the first time in 6 years. The dining room watched in absolute silence. Club members, shelter residents, staff, and news crew alike stood frozen in witness to a reunion that transcended anything they had expected to see. Tears flowed freely throughout the room, shed by strangers who had no connection to this family beyond the shared human capacity to recognize love when it appeared in its most raw and desperate form. Terrence had bowed his head, his shoulders shaking silently. Maria pressed both hands against her mouth, her eyes streaming. Ruth stood at attention, her own composure finally cracking as she watched the man she had spent 6 years searching for finally find his way home. The embrace lasted for minutes that felt like hours. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sounds were the mingled sobs of a father and his children, the small gasps for breath between waves of weeping, the whispered words that were not meant for anyone else to hear. Finally, slowly, they separated enough to look at each other. Amara's hands came up to cup her father's face, her thumbs tracing the new lines that 6 years of hardship had carved into his features. "You look so thin," she said, her voice cracking. "You look so tired." "I am sorry," Clement whispered. The words seemed pathetically inadequate, but they were all he had. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I thought I was protecting you. I thought my absence would hurt less than my presence." Marcus shook his head. His voice, when he spoke, carried the steadiness of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news in hospital corridors, but beneath it ran a current of emotion that threatened to sweep away his professional composure. "We never needed protection from you, Dad. We needed you, even broken, even struggling. We needed our father." Clement's face crumpled again. "I cannot look at you without seeing her," he confessed. "Every time I saw your smile, Amara, I saw your mother. Every time I heard you laugh, Marcus, I heard her voice underneath. I thought if I stayed, I would drown, and I would take you both down with me." Amara gripped his hands with fierce intensity. "So you left us to wonder if you were alive or dead. You left us to search every shelter and every morgue and every John Doe report in the country. You left us to imagine you frozen in an alley or beaten in a doorway or simply gone forever." The words were harsh, but they carried no malice. They were the truth, spoken aloud at last, lancing a wound that had festered for 6 years. "I know," Clement said. "I know what I did. I know it cost you, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." Marcus put his hand on his father's shoulder. "We do not want amends, Dad. We do not want apologies. We wanted to come home." Clement looked at his son, at the man he had become in his father's absence, at the healer who saved lives in emergency rooms while his own father rotted under a bridge. "Home," he repeated, as though the word belonged to a foreign language he had forgotten how to speak. Amara nodded fiercely. "Home," she confirmed. "With us. Where you belong. Where you have always belonged." The simplicity of the offer staggered him. After everything he had done, everything he had failed to do, they were not demanding explanations or extracting promises. They were simply asking him to return. Ruth stepped forward. She addressed Marcus and Amara with the respect of a commanding officer speaking to equals. "Your father served this country with extraordinary distinction," she said. "He saved lives in circumstances that most people cannot imagine. But the wounds he carries are not visible on any medical chart. He will need support, professional help, patience." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I'm a trauma surgeon, General. I understand invisible wounds. And Amara's entire career has been dedicated to helping veterans find their way back." He looked at his father. "We are ready. We have been ready for 6 years." Amara reached into her purse and withdrew a photograph. She pressed it into Clement's trembling hands. It showed 2 young children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 4 years old, with Clement's eyes and Adora's smile. "Your grandchildren," she said softly. "Adora and Yosef. We named them for the people we lost." She paused. They had been waiting to meet their grandfather. Clement stared at the photograph. Grandchildren, named for his wife and his fallen brother. A continuation of everything he had believed was lost. The tears came again, but these were different. These were not tears of grief or guilt or shame. These were tears of something he had not felt in 6 years. Hope. 3 months later, Clement Odia sat on the back porch of the house in Philadelphia that his children had insisted on buying. It was large enough for all of them, with a room for him that still felt foreign despite the weeks he had spent there, and a backyard where 2 4-year-olds could run and shriek and demand that their grandfather push them on the swing set Marcus had assembled on a snowy January weekend. The therapy sessions happened twice a week now. Dr. Patterson, a VA psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma, had warned him that healing would not be linear, that there would be setbacks and dark days and moments when the old impulse to run would surge up like a tide. But she had also told him something else, something that had lodged in his chest like a splinter working its way toward his heart. Surviving is not betraying the dead. Surviving is honoring them. He was learning to believe it. Amara appeared at the screen door with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to her father and settled into the chair beside him, tucking her feet beneath her the way she had done since childhood. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb above the fence line and paint the frost-covered grass in shades of gold. The Bekele Foundation had received $300,000 in donations since the video went viral. Amara did not speak of it often, understanding that her father found the attention uncomfortable, but the money had allowed them to expand services to 4 new cities and hire a full-time staff of veteran counselors. Something good had grown from the painful soil of that Thanksgiving afternoon. Ruth Castellano visited once a month. She and Clement would sit in this same spot, drinking coffee, talking about Yosef and the others they had lost. Sometimes they spoke of missions that remained classified, sharing details that could never be recorded but needed to be witnessed by someone who understood. Ruth had become something between a commander and a sister, a bridge between the man Clement had been and the man he was becoming. Terrence had moved into one of the transitional housing units that Amara's organization operated. He and Clement met every Sunday at a diner halfway between their homes, sharing meals and silences and the particular comfort of men who had walked through darkness together. Terrence was learning to let his own family back in, inspired by what he had witnessed in that country club dining room. Maria Reyes had left the serving job at the Whitmore Country Club. She was enrolled in nursing school now, funded by a scholarship that Preston Whitmore had personally established for veterans seeking medical careers. She sent Clement a card every few weeks, updating him on her progress, thanking him for the words that had given her permission to keep trying. Preston himself had undergone a transformation that those who knew him struggled to recognize. He had resigned from 3 corporate boards to focus on a new veterans housing initiative, working alongside organizations he had once written checks to without understanding. The performative philanthropy had given way to something quieter and more genuine. He visited the shelter where Clement had once stayed, not with cameras, but with work gloves, helping to renovate a building that would house 40 veterans by spring. The news coverage had faded, as news coverage always did. The viral video had been replaced by newer outrages and inspirations, the attention span of the public moving on to the next story. But the ripples continued to spread in ways that cameras could not capture. Veterans who had seen the footage reached out to families they had abandoned. Families who had given up searching renewed their efforts. The story of the Medal of Honor recipient found in a country club dining room had become a quiet legend in the veteran community, proof that it was never too late to come home. The screen door creaked open again, and 2 small bodies burst onto the porch. Adora and Yosef, named for the grandmother they would never meet, and the uncle who existed only in their grandfather's stories, launched themselves at Clement with the fearless certainty of children who had never known rejection. "Grandpa," Adora demanded, her voice carrying her mother's commanding tone. You promised to show us the stars tonight. Clement lifted her onto his lap, marveling as he did every day at the weight and warmth of this small person who carried his bloodline forward. I did promise, he agreed, and a soldier always keeps his promises. From inside the house came the sound of Marcus arriving home from his hospital shift, his voice mingling with his sister's as they discussed something in the kitchen. The ordinary music of family life, a symphony Clement had thought he would never hear again. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the astronomy book that had traveled with him through 31 years of service and 6 years of exile. Its pages were worn soft as cloth, its binding held together with tape and faith. Adora had given it to him on their wedding night, her inscription still visible on the inside, covered despite decades of handling. Tonight he would read from it to his grandchildren, pointing out the constellations through the window of the room that was finally, impossibly his. He would tell them about Orion the hunter and Cassiopeia the queen and the North Star that guided travelers home. He would teach them the same lessons he had taught their mother and uncle on a porch in North Carolina a lifetime ago, when Adora stood in the doorway, watching with love in her eyes. She was still watching. He believed that now, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a presence woven into everything good that remained. She was in Amara's determination and Marcus's steady hands. She was in the grandchildren who bore pieces of her face. She was in the stars themselves, the ancient light that had guided humanity since before memory. If you're watching this story from wherever you are in the world, if it has reminded you that second chances exist even when we believe we have wandered too far to deserve them, we hope you will carry its message forward. Subscribe to hear more stories of courage and redemption, and share in the comments the hidden heroes in your own life, the quiet warriors who wear no medals but fight battles every day. Remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary, and some of them might simply need someone to see them clearly, to recognize the worth that humble appearances cannot hide. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for believing that it is never too late to find your way home. Clement closed his eyes and let the morning sun warm his face. Somewhere in the house, his grandchildren were laughing. Somewhere in the city, veterans he would never meet were finding their way to help because of a story that started with an insult in a country club dining room. Still here, brother, he whispered to the sky, to Yosef, to all the fallen who walked beside him still trying. And finally home.